Let's talk Dugri. Let's talk Dugri. Let's talk Dugri. And I suggest we talk openly and honestly. Let's listen to one another. Let's do as we say in the Middle East, let's talk Dugri. That means straightforward. I'll tell you my needs and concerns. You'll tell me yours. And with God's help, we'll find the common ground of peace.
Live from New York, this is the Bibi Report live show on Israel.
Would like to say a very early good morning to Aharon HaCohen, who is joining us from Israel. It is very bright and early, guys. It is 4 in the morning in Jerusalem right now, and I had contacted Aaron toward the end of last week and asked if he would appear on our program to discuss with you and I, Jacob, the issue of Gilad Shalit, what that means for Israel. And Aaron, I have known him and his family here in the States. He is a very brave Israeli. He and his family live up in the north, and I don't want to give any more information than that other than to state he is someone who Israel will rely upon if there is an emergency in Israel. So good morning, Aaron. Thank you for joining us.
Good evening. I'm happy I can join you at this early hour. Not sure if it's even morning because I can't see the sun yet, but we'll get here eventually.
I'm usually up 4 a.m. So for me, it's not morning; it's still evening, even though 6 hours difference.
Okay, everybody has their own schedules.
Yeah.
That's right.
Hello.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we have you.
Okay.
Eric, go ahead.
To begin, Aaron, if you could describe for our audience, because you were actually a part of the IDF prior to the Operation Cast-Lead incident that we saw take place in 2009, if you can provide for our audience just a bit of your background and your work within the IDF, what you're able to safely discuss. We know that we can't let everything be put out there. But just give our audience a little bit of your background that you're able to securely provide.
Sure. Like most Israelis, I went into the IDF after high school. In my case, I pushed it off for a year because I did another year of studies before I went into the IDF. I served in the IDF during what's called the Second Intifada period, which began in 2000. I actually went into the IDF in August 2000, and 1 month after I was drafted, while I was still in basic training, is when the uprising broke out in September 2000, which is, if you recall, it's when Arik Sharon went up to the Temple Mount, and that was used as an excuse by Yasser Arafat to begin the what they call the Second Arab Uprising, meaning the first uprising was in 1988 or 1987. But this time, of course, it was a lot more violent. So the attacks that started in September 2000 and they continued for several years, I was serving in combat between 2000 and 2003, which was really the most intense period of those attacks. And I did a lot of operations in Judea and Samaria, or what some people in the world call the West Bank, and which involved a lot of raids to capture terrorists, either terrorists that had already carried out attacks or terrorists that we had intelligence that they were going to carry out attacks, and collecting weapons, a lot of times weapons that were ironically provided by your United States administration, and the such. So it was very, very intense period, and of course, I lost quite a few friends of mine, as many people in Israel here did, and now, like most Israelis who did combat service afterwards, you are in reserve. You're in reserve duty for whenever they need to call you up.
Do you know of any big names that you are able to share that you know were captured during the Second Intifada that were released last week in the prisoner swap?
I know there's for example, I know the full list is available online, but I know that Netanyahu did make an effort not to release some of the bigger names. There were a few names that he was adamant that he was not going to release them. For example, there was Barghouti, who was he was one of the leading guys behind the Second Intifada, for Fatah, and he wasn't released. And then there's Ahmed Sadat, who was he was behind the assassination of Rehavam Zevi, who was a minister in the government. Those are examples of people who were not released. But I know then you have a lot of individual murderers who carried out some of the worst attacks. Like, for example, there's this woman named Muna who
kills Aharon.
She's infamous, right, for that murder, where she seduced this young boy basically from Jerusalem to Ramallah through the internet, and then she had him murdered. She was one of the, and then you have people who I can't recall their names who were behind the suicide bombings that occurred in Jerusalem and in Kfar Saba, and there's a lot of, if you go down the list, there's a lot of people. There's the people that were involved in the kidnapping of Nachshon Wachsman in 1994, which ironically back then a labor government, Rabin's government, I think they dealt with the kidnapping situation a lot better than we did this time, despite the fact that it didn't end very well with, Nachshon Wachsman was killed at the time, as well as Nir Poraz, who was one of the... Yes, go ahead.
That tragic incident stood before the Israeli leadership when they would have decided of any military operation against in releasing Gilad Shalit in the weeks after his captivity, I guess.
Right. I know that is one of the considerations they had. I think if Netanyahu was in power at the time, because he wasn't elected in 2009. If he was in power in 2006, there's a good chance I think he might have done such an operation, which I think Olmert was not willing to take that kind of risk, simply because I know Netanyahu's background with his family. He was involved himself in many operations. I mean, even before his brother was killed at Entebbe, he himself was involved in many operations to free hostages in the early 1970s. And then his brother, of course, was killed at Entebbe in 76. So I think, but I think that definitely would have been a better route to take. When we're looking at the consequences of this deal, where you have thousands of murderers and who knows how many more there will be as a result.
So let me be candid a minute with you. For your personal opinion, for somebody, I'm asked my opinion as an American, as somebody that lived in Israel at the time of Intifada, was a few meters away from a bomb exploding in Kikat Zion on Migrash HaRusim, and seeing the Sbarro tragic terror attack and so on.
Yes.
As an Israeli,
and you're aware, of course, that one of the people that planned or that helped the Sbarro attack was also released.
I was actually on the Chav Yafo at that very day, and I watched it closely, and I saw the outrage of the orphans, the Scheves brothers, against this deal. But as somebody that served in the IDF and as an Israeli citizen, do you support this deal of releasing a soldier out of captivity in exchange of 1,000 terrorists or prisoners?
Absolutely not. I mean, I'd like to preface my comments by saying, first of all, I think it's important that the American audience understand that it's not that I have a lot of sympathy for the Shalit family. I happen to live right near them, and when the deal was completed, and last Tuesday when Gilad Shalit was brought home, my wife and I went and we waited for the helicopter to land. We watched the helicopter land, and we cheered when we were very happy along with many other Israelis when he arrived home to his family. So there's no doubt that, I completely understand the Shalit family, and, I understand that they wanted to do whatever they thought was possible to bring their son home. At the same time, I think, having said that, how happy I am for the family, I think they themselves caused a lot of damage here with the way they handled themselves over the last 5 years, because they chose to do a large PR campaign. They hired PR specialists and marketing people, and they spent a lot of money into raising awareness for the issue of their son's captivity. Now, what that did is it didn't actually help neither Gilad nor Israel, because it really raised the price of getting Gilad home. Because what happened naturally in a negotiation, when Hamas sees that they're making all this noise in the media, both in Israel and overseas, and putting all this pressure on the government, they say, well, why should we release Gilad cheap? We may as well wait, because we're going to get whatever we want from him, because there's so much pressure being put by the Shalit family on the government. So as a result, well, first of all, I think if there wasn't all this big media campaign, there's a possibility that Hamas would have agreed a while ago to a deal that did not involve nearly as many murderers, and might have involved maybe 100 or 200, but we wouldn't be talking about 1,027, I think was the final number. At the same time, in principle, I would not agree to a deal if I were in the government. I mean, of course I'm not, but if I were in the government, I would not vote for any deal that was for releasing more than one terrorist or prisoner for one soldier. There was a committee. I think it's still ongoing. They haven't published the report, called the Shamgar Commission, that's dealt with this hostage dilemma on what you do with in hostage cases like this. And they talk to a lot of professionals, military people, and people who have experience dealing with hostage situations. Their conclusions were that Israel's policy in principle should never be to do any deal other than one for one. The only deal that makes sense strategically is one for one. If they have one soldier, then you will release one prisoner for that soldier, and that's it. Because otherwise, once it becomes one for 100, one for 1,000, and who knows how much more the number is going to grow next time, God forbid, right. Then there is no end to these kidnappings. I mean, right now you see all over the Arab world, they're talking about we need to kidnap more Israelis, more soldiers. You have an Arab sheikh in Saudi Arabia offering $100,000. And this causes a lot of strategic damage when, frankly, the Arabs see our weakness. I mean, Israelis, I know they like to say, they have this slogan, they say, we value life more than they do. But that slogan, it really weakens us, because what it tells our Arab enemies is we are willing to do anything all you have to do is find a way to capture one soldier, or it could be one civilian next time, and we will do anything. It doesn't matter how much it damages our security in order to get that one person back. And when we're thinking only about that one person, in this case it's Gilad Shalit, who we all see his picture everywhere. We have his stickers on our cars and everything. When we're only thinking about him, then we start forgetting about all the people who, statistically speaking, are going to die as a result of this deal. In previous deals like the Jibril deal in 1985, where they released over 1,000 terrorists, and there's other deals, the Tenenbaum deal in I think it was 2003, where we released numerous terrorists just for this drug dealer. He wasn't even a soldier; he was just a drug dealer in Lebanon. And these precedents, they create a situation which our enemies know that it's very worthwhile for them to kidnap, and they're going to continue trying to kidnap as long as we don't put our foot down and say enough. And another thing I should mention is if you look at the way America has dealt with this hostage issue in general, even I have to give praise even for the Obama administration, even though I do not have a lot of respect for President Obama. But on this issue, I think they've dealt with it a lot better than the Israeli government has. You may not be aware of it, but there is an American soldier who I can't think of his name, who was captured by the Taliban, I think, about 3 years ago. And nobody in the U.S., maybe except for the people in his hometown, even know the person's name. But he has been in captivity for 3 years. The Taliban have very similar demands to Hamas. They're also demanding release a lot of their prisoners, and they want America to leave their lands in Afghanistan. So it's a very similar situation. Yet the U.S. does not have this kind of public pressure on the government to release this one soldier, which they know that this could endanger a lot of other soldiers in the future, and it can endanger America's security if they went that route. So yes, go ahead.
So let me ask you two questions. First of all, when 80% of the Israeli public support this deal, according to the polls, is it wise to go against the will of the people? And my next question as a follow-up is that could a leader change the public opinion in shift towards his policies, as if Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would have countered that PR campaign with the campaign, as you stressed, that we cannot release more than one-on-one to release such a soldier, and therefore the only way how to release Gilad Shalit is if Hamas will release him by international pressure. Would that have worked? Did he have another possibility?
I think there was a lot that this is not all Netanyahu's fault, first of all, because he was not in power for the first 3 years. I think the Olmert administration made a lot of mistakes in the way they dealt with this. Of course, we don't know all the details. First of all, it's not only the government's fault. A lot of the blame really lies with the IDF. The IDF, this is a serious intelligence failure that for 5.5 years they were not able to locate, or even if they did locate where he was, the fact is that they weren't able to figure out an effective way to be able to release him. That is something that the IDF has to deal with internally, because the Gaza Strip is not very big. And we're not talking about trying to find, a soldier in the hills of Tora Bora or Afghanistan or something. We're talking about a very, very small area. And if they weren't able to locate him, and even if they weren't able to pull off the kind of, Ed Tebi raid or Nachshon Waxman kind of raid, they still were able, there's ways you can put pressure on Hamas. For example, we've done it in the past. For example, you can go in and you can kidnap, quote unquote, the heads of Hamas. We could have taken the heads of Hamas and said, here, we're not going to release the heads of Hamas. It could be Ismail Haniyeh, it could be any of the other leadership, and say, we're not going to release these people until you release Gilad Shalit. We could have put not only a blockade on Gaza like we have, but we could have put a lot more pressure by, if in 2009, when we went in for Cast Lead, if we would have actually finished the job, meaning we only went about halfway into Gaza, and when we surrounded Gaza City and the main command centers, we did not go all the way and actually take out the Hamas leadership, which those are things that had we done them, we could have put a lot of pressure on Hamas to release Gilad, because it wouldn't have been worthwhile for them to hold him if we would have just basically undermined their whole control of Gaza. So there's a lot of things we could have done, both politically and militarily, beyond international pressure, but actually on the ground putting pressure on them, which obviously were not done, or if we tried to do them, they were not done very effectively. So I think it's beyond just PR. I mean, if you're talking about Netanyahu, I think he did, at least for the last 2 years, he did have this position in principle, which you heard him say over and over on the media, that he's in principle against releasing terrorists for Gilad. Why he changed his mind on that, it's a bit of a mystery. In the interviews after the deal, he wasn't really clear about that. He said that vaguely that the situation in the Middle East changed, and he talked about the Arab Spring and things like that, but it wasn't really a very clear answer as to why he decided to do it. I mean, I think, frankly, he did probably cave to a bit of public pressure, and I'm sure he was thinking about keeping his government stable, because, in Israel, it's a coalition government, which is never, always stable, and all it takes is one or two parties like Shas or Yisrael Beitenu who can easily just collapse the government if they want to. So I think there were political considerations here more than necessarily strategic considerations.
I want to get back to that public support, and there was a poll released a day after the release that showed actually almost 80% of the Israeli population in favor of this deal. However, 67% said that this deal is likely to increase Hamas' willingness to carry out more terror attacks against Israel, and a high of 87% said that this might motivate them to kidnap another soldier. So how do you draw the lines between paying this high price and supporting such a deal, if you know that after you're taking this risk of releasing Gilad Shalit, Israeli citizens and their blood are going to be the ones to pay for this swap deal?
Right. That's the funny thing about polls, is that depending what question you ask, you're going to get a very different answer. And even if you're asking the same question 1 minute after you ask a different question that's contradictory in this case, that's what you see in polls. You see that in the States too with election polls. They ask one question about, do you like Obama, and then the next question they compare Obama with somebody else, and you get very different answers. So
tell me about it.
Yeah, so it's polls are not, I think that when they ask that question about, what price will you pay for Gilad Shalit, because of the PR campaign that I mentioned, people have so much sympathy for Gilad Shalit, they can't say no to a question like that, regardless of what the price is. But then, of course, Israelis, because we have the history of all the terrorist attacks, that, you have your experience with Sbarro, and I think every Israeli who has lived there for the last couple of decades has their own personal experiences with terror. And then when they start thinking about that, then they say, oh, yes, I'm aware about the price, and, they know the enemy we're dealing with. So it's a very emotional kind of thing that it's hard for people to react in a rational manner to those kind of questions. When they see Gilad's face in front of them wherever they go, they say, well, how can I abandon Gilad? But I think the answer is, that if Israelis really thought about it rationally, and there are a lot of Israelis that are thinking about it rationally, some of them more after the deal. For example, I signed a petition that was put up on the internet. I don't think it's in English. It's only
on
in
Rota.net.
Possibly, they have it on a few sites. It's a reserve petition. and it's of reserve soldiers who serve in combat units who they were asked basically to make a statement saying, basically the statement says, we're not going to say anything about the Gilad Shalit deal because the deal happened and whatever happened, happened. But in the future, as reserve soldiers, we would like to make it clear that if, God forbid, we are ever put in a situation where we are taken captive on the battlefield, we do not want Israel to release any terrorists in order to free us. Because we understand the strategic people, put their names to it and their rank to it. So not a number right now, but in any case, I mean that's a very powerful statement to make, and I think it's very important that if the Israelis are willing to make that statement and say, yes, I care about my life. Of course I do care about my life, and I care about my family, and my family is going to want to see me home. But I understand that I'm going to endanger the entire people of Israel, and I might also endanger my own life, actually, if we don't take a stand and say no to releasing terrorists. And the fact is that if you want to reduce the chance of kidnappings in the future, that is the best way to deal with it, is to say, no, we are not going to release anybody. You're not going to get the reward you want out of kidnapping me, so it's not worth you going through that effort.
Wow. God bless you for taking that courageous step in declaring even such a statement. But let me ask you this. Following this deal and somebody living in Israel, do you think that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's flexibility is a thought of concern if he's able to stand up against Iran or to protect Israel's interests in future peace negotiations, not caving in to international and public pressure?
Well, I don't know. Look, I'll tell you, I'm not really a big fan of the whole international pressure line of thinking, because it's something that politicians here in Israel, they like throwing out these slogans of, we have to do this because of this is what the world is going to think, etc. Those are claims that usually they make them when they have other political considerations for doing things. I think that was the case with this Shalit deal. There were political considerations, and then as an excuse, you'll hear government representatives saying, well, we had to do this because there was political pressure. That was the same kind of thing you heard that with, for example, the disengagement from Gaza in 2005, which I think most Israelis recognize now that was a complete disaster. Sharon at the time, even though it was his own initiative, he would explain to the press, oh, we have to do this. We have to leave Gaza because that will alleviate the international pressure on us. And, of course, we have seen the opposite is the case. That didn't alleviate international pressure. Leaving Gaza, it only created more international pressure that we should do the same in the West Bank or in Judea and Samaria. So that whole line of thinking, I don't like thinking that way. I like Israel making strategic decisions because it's in Israel's interest and not because what the international community may or may not say. So regarding Iran, I think Israel, I've been saying for the last 10, 15 years, as Netanyahu was before he was in power, that the Israeli government has to do what's necessary to protect Israel's interests. And if the United States or somebody else is not going to do that, then Israel has to do it. But the truth is, there has been some progress regarding Iran. Of course, we don't know what's been going on behind the scenes. There's constantly different reports coming out regarding scientists there and regarding, the Stuxnet program, all sorts of other programs that were against the Iranian nuclear technology. So, of course, they have been doing things behind the scenes. We don't know exactly who's doing them or what's being done. But, I don't think ultimately that Israel has to make decisions based on what the international community, which basically is, the West, thinks about it. Ultimately, Israel has to do what's necessary. So I hope the people in power that have all that information that I don't necessarily have are doing what's necessary, regardless of what the international community may think.
President Obama announced this week the withdrawal of American troops from Iraq within the next month or two. Is it a matter of concern for Israel as the route Iran, Iraq, and Syria, Lebanon, from the other side, Sudan, Egypt, Hamas in Gaza, can this vacuum that the Americans are leaving over result in a Iran takeover of the Middle East?
I think absolutely. I mean, I think, what the Western media likes calling the Arab Spring, I think it's turning out right now to be more of a battle between Iran and the Shiite extremists on the one hand versus you have the Al-Qaeda, Sunni extremists on the other hand. And they're the ones that are right now fighting in all these countries to reap the fruits of what they're calling the Arab Spring, because that's what you see in all these countries where the New York Times might try to portray it as the citizens that are yearning for democracy, but we see, frankly, there has never been a Arab democracy. It's questionable whether there ever will be an Arab democracy, despite the great visions of George Bush and others about Iraq. I don't see a democracy there yet, but so Iran, of course, is trying to take advantage of the situation where all these dictatorial regimes are suddenly collapsing, with whether it's Gaddafi, Mubarak, and now Assad. That might go that way as well. And what happened with Saddam Hussein, and so all these dictatorial regimes were, of course, very brutal regimes and very anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, but at the same time they maintained control of the masses. Now the masses are getting their free will, quote unquote, but their free will is not democracy. Their free will is usually just a more extreme dictatorial regime is what they actually want. In many cases, they want an Islamist regime. So it's a question of what kind of Islamist regime will emerge in all these countries, whether it's going to be a Iranian-backed Islamist regime, or whether it's going to be a Al-Qaeda style or Muslim Brotherhood Islamic regime. And so Iran, frankly, that is the biggest threat of the concept of a two-state solution. I hate to bring it back to Israel, but it always comes back to Israel here, is that Iran, if any deal were to be signed, even if it were to be signed with Fatah, with Abbas, who supposedly is the great moderate, as the Western mind sees it, let's say in theory that he were moderate and he recognized the Jewish state, which he never will, still he would not remain in power for very long. And very quickly, any Palestinian states that were built on the hills of Judea and Samaria overlooking Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, that would very quickly become an Iranian puppet state, because Hamas would take over and Iran would try to exert its influence. And you see exactly what you see in Gaza right now, where Iran has a lot of influence in Gaza. And of course, in Lebanon, since we left Lebanon in 2000, it's become a Iranian puppet state in Lebanon as well. So that, I think you look at Lebanon and Gaza, and that is Iran's vision for the Middle East. And I think you see that in Iraq as well to an extent. I mean, as like you were saying, as Obama pulls out of Iraq, ultimately you see Iran is going to take power there. And I don't see I don't really see a very free democratic future for Iraq. I see a very gloom future with a lot of Iranian influence in Iraq. And I guess, it brings to question the whole what happened with the whole Iraq war and the whole, when Bush went into Iraq, like many Israelis, I supported it. I supported it mainly because Saddam Hussein was a very serious threat to Israel. and I thought it was important to get rid of the Saddam regime and the threat that he posed. At the same time, I had no illusions that this Iraq war was going to lead to democracy in Iraq, because, frankly, I've never seen an Arab democracy, like I said, and I don't think Arab culture is going to change overnight and just going to embrace democracy. So, I think Obama is making a mistake by taking troops out of Iraq, not because the troops being there are going to bring freedom and democracy to Iraq, but because they need to be there in order to counter the threats that come from Iran and from, on the other side, from Al-Qaeda.
I just want to bring a point in here, and I'm glad you brought up Iran, Aaron. Back in 2007, very cold winter night, this is February of 2007, I was in downtown Chicago for a meeting with, then it was the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, which is now the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And Vali Nasser, who is a Shiite Muslim, who is also the professor of international politics at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and an adjunct senior fellow for the Middle East, who's connected to the Chicago Global Council on Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He spoke, and he had just published a book shortly before that time talking about the Shia revival. And most interestingly, we are almost 4 years now past an article that appeared in Foreign Policy journal called Foreign Affairs. And the article title was The Cost of Containing Iran. It's an article written by him and one of his colleagues, and it deals with what they discussed as Washington's misguided new Middle East policy. And he writes in the article, and this is back in the beginning of 2008, he said, over the past year, Washington has come to see the containment of Iran as its primary objective of its Middle East policy, and that it holds Tehran responsible for rising violence in Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon's tribulations, and Hamas's intransience, and senses the balance of the power in the region is shifting toward Iran and its Islamist allies. And you and I know, Jacob knows, that to curb Tehran's growing influence is absolutely necessary for the survival of the region, much less its regional security. And things have simply gone to hell. Dick Cheney stated regarding the region in May of 2007, he said, we will stand with our friends in opposing extremism and strategic threats. We will continue to bring relief to those who suffer and deliver justice to the enemies of freedom. And we will stand with others to prevent Iran from gaining nuclear weapons and dominating the region. And there was similar sentiment that was expressed by then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. And she stated, Iran constitutes the single most important single country strategic challenge to the United States and to the kind of Middle East we want to see. Well, here we are. This is 5 years ago that these statements were made, and it appears by all measures that our foreign policy has been an utter failure, because if people saw what was coming 4 and 5 years ago in that region, they obviously have not taken the right steps to prevent what should have been done. And we can go back to May of 2008 when Bush was still in office. At that point, the Israelis had the opportunity, but were only given an amber light by the Bush administration to have a strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. And now we've reached a point of critical mass. And I believe, as do others within the intelligence community, that Iran already possesses nuclear weapons, and they have the vehicles capable of delivering them. Whether they're crewed or not does not matter, because they still have the ability to deliver a crewed nuclear weapon. And because of the rogue powers that exist within the region and Iran's cooperative efforts with North Korea, Russia, Venezuela, and other forces that are siding with Ahmadinejad, there's no reason to think that Iran does not possess these weapons. So in your thought, in looking at the fact that Iran represents this tremendous threat to the region, do you foresee the Israelis having still a window of opportunity to go after Iran's nuclear program, its facilities? It's going to be much more difficult now, as John Bolton has pointed out, because there are multiple sites that will have to be hit. And if the United States, at least this administration, is not going to work with Israel on it, Israel would be largely left to do this mission alone. But do you foresee, if we have a change in administration in November of 2012, would Israel go after these sites in Iran, or do you think that Israel will possibly go after these sites before the elections of November 2012?
Well, it's a very loaded question, and
yes,
a lot of these things have political considerations that are not. It does not only have to do with the American election cycle. It also has to do with the Israeli election cycle, and
correct.
Like in America, where you're going to be, in Israel, they know when the elections will be, and there's constant speculation as to when the government may collapse, when they might call for new elections. There's a lot of considerations, including, I'll just mention one of the considerations is that there's an ongoing investigation against Victor Lieberman, the former foreign minister, who has a lot of power since he's the head of the second biggest party in the government, and he has. And if that investigation leads to an indictment, that can lead to his party eventually leaving the government, which can lead to new elections. That's just one scenario. I'm just mentioning that because that could have implications in terms of these kind of decisions. If Netanyahu thinks that there's going to be elections soon, that might play a part in whether he decides to go and strike Iran. So it's not only about what happens with the next American elections, but frankly, you look back over the last 3 administrations, and there's been talk about Netanyahu himself was pushing for a strike on Iran, back already 10 years ago in the beginning of the Bush administration. Frankly, if 9/11 had not occurred, we might have seen a strike on Iran, in the early part of that decade. I think what happened in 9/11 completely changed things, and I think you can also make the argument that perhaps going into Iraq and Afghanistan should have been less of a priority than, or maybe at the same level of a priority as going into Iran. But that's, I guess that's something we have to deal with later, historically speaking, to determine whether perhaps the Bush administration made a mistake by not doing something about Iran earlier on. But at this point, I really don't know if there's going to be a strike on Iran, because you have to wonder why it hasn't happened over the last, 10 years. I remember I was studying, I was in college, I was studying political science back in 2005, I believe it was, and I wrote a paper then in 2005 in which I was arguing that the strike on Iran needs to take place right now, imminently, and I don't understand why the U.S. or Israel is not doing anything about it right now. And here we are, 6-7 years later, and we don't see any change in that situation. So, you can talk about the upcoming election cycle, but we've been through this a number of times. In 2008, we were talking about the upcoming elections, and in 2004, we were talking about the upcoming elections, and we don't see anything changing. So it might just be that we don't have leaders, both in the U.S. and Israel, with the guts to actually to do something that because I understand the consequences of a strike on Iran. It's not going to end in one day. It's going to lead to missile strikes from Lebanon. It's going to lead to attacks on us from all directions. And that is a courageous decision that a leader has to take, that they're willing to deal with the consequences in the short term because they understand the long-term implications. So, frankly, we might not have had the leaders that had the courage to make that decision, but I'd like to believe that will change. I just the history of the last 10-15 years doesn't indicate that it will.
So this leads me to my final question, as you mentioned it already. First of all, do you think that any of the Republican candidates in the field right now are ready to answer this 3 a.m. call and deal with the chaos we are left with after these 3 years and the Arab Spring, as we like to call it? And to follow up, I'm not sure if you're aware with it, but there's right now a debate in the United States between various Jewish groups to sign a unity pledge not to bring up Israel as an issue for bashing candidates in this election, to keep Israel as a bipartisan issue. Do you think that by avoiding a discussion on the U.S. policy regarding Israel, we are doing good for Israel, or we are actually harming Israel's interest by trying to look away the failures of the U.S. administration over the past few years? It's not only over the last 2.5, 3 years, it's way back. And just to mention that I just came across Thomas Friedman wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and Eric, you will love this. The headline is Barack, Kissinger, Obama, and he actually criticizes Obama for implementing George W. Bush foreign policy much more successful than he claims Bush did. So what's your reaction to that?
Well, first of all, I'm not a big fan of Tom Friedman, as I think most Israelis are not a big fan of him right now. I mean, he's really gone down the deep end the last few years.
When I saw this.
What's that?
I almost got a heart attack when I saw this headline.
Yeah. At the same, going back to Israel advocacy and Israel, Israel-related politics within the U.S. I think there's two sides to the coin. First of all, I think I'm very frustrated by organizations like AIPAC and the people who supposedly lead the pro-Israel lobbying effort. I think Eric shares this sentiment from his own experiences, that they throw out this slogan of bipartisanship in order to basically quiet any voices of dissent within the pro-Israel lobbying community. What I mean by that is they will say, okay, we need to have a consensus between the Democrats and Republicans for the good of Israel, so we will therefore find a supposed quote-unquote consensus position that we are going to support, which usually means a very watered-down kind of pro-Israel position, which does not have any meaning to it. For example, dealing with the Palestinians, they will refuse to take a strong stand against the Palestinian state, and they will not encourage any people in Congress or candidates for president to take any strong stand against the Palestinian state, because they want this kind of bipartisan support. So that very much hurts Israeli advocacy if you believe that you really want a strong Israel, because you're saying, okay, I'm willing to take 90% of Congress saying that they're pro-Israel, if that means that pro-Israel, the meaning of pro-Israel is watered down. So that's what happens as well in this presidential campaign when I really do not support such a pledge that says, okay, we're not going to talk about Israel because we want everybody to just be vaguely pro-Israel, but we're not going to get into the details. I think it's very important that in the presidential campaign and in the entire discourse that goes on in Washington, that we talk very seriously what it means to be pro-Israel. And I'm willing to sacrifice this bipartisan support, quote unquote, for the sake of having, even if it's 20% of Congress or a couple of the candidates, whether it's Republicans or Democrats, who are willing to stand up and take a real stand for policies that are going to be good for Israel, and not just say, I am pro-Israel because I agree with the statements of AIPAC. So I think it's very important to have a debate about Israel. If you're talking about specific candidates, I have to say right now, I am not very enthusiastic. I am still a citizen with with voting rights. I can vote from abroad, and I probably will vote in the primary. But I can't say that I right now have a horse in the race, because frankly, I'm I'm a bit disappointed by what I've seen from the current field. I mean, yes, I have seen some positive statements from people, from Rick Perry, from Herman Cain, even from Mitt Romney. But, you know, just the fact that you hear positive statements from Mitt Romney right now means absolutely nothing because, frankly, just for example, he's a person that, you know, over the years he's made a lot of statements which later on he didn't back up. So, you know, I take a lot of what you hear right now in the Republican primary about Israel, I'd take with a grain of salt. To put it into perspective, you may recall a certain AIPAC speech given by a certain Barack Hussein Obama just in 2008, in which he made you can go on YouTube, in which he makes the declaration that he will always support a united and undivided Jerusalem. And then later on, when, of course, he was asked about that, he completely denied that that's what he meant. He said he wanted an undivided Jerusalem, but he didn't mean an undivided Jerusalem. So those are the kind of statements you're going to hear during this election cycle from candidates who are trying to court the Jewish and the pro-Israel conservative vote. And therefore, right now, I would rather see a candidate, whoever it is, who's willing to actually stand up and say, you know what, I'm not going to just take the AIPAC line and say, I support Israel. I'm going to actually get into specifics. And, you know, for example, I did like what I saw from, you know, Mike Huckabee in the previous campaign, where he took a lot of flack for the fact that he was willing to get into the details and say, I am opposed to a Palestinian state. You know, if you want to build a Palestinian state, I support building a Palestinian state in one of the existing 23 Arab countries. Those kind of statements are actually helpful because you're getting into specifics about what it means to be pro-Israel instead of just throwing out vague statements like Israel is our best friend and I will support them, blah, 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 because those statements don't have any meaning once you get into office because you can say, you can do anything and then say, oh yeah, I'm still pro-Israel. So I'm still waiting to see some more specifics, and I hope that there is a very real debate about Israel in this Republican primary. And I think, you know, it's actually a very helpful thing that you have people like Ron Paul, who, as nutty as he is, he's willing to say what he thinks. And if he's willing to say what he thinks, he challenges the other candidates to stand up to him and say why he's wrong. And that's what I want to hear from the candidates.
Aaron, back in April, I met with Herman Cain in Chicago. I do know he is pro-Israel to the core. And the sad thing, though, is this. As I've watched his campaign,
his chief of staff smokes.
What?
Well, frankly, I guess if his chief of staff smokes, then he has something to do, you know, in common with Israel, because a lot of Israelis still smoke. That's something we have to deal with in this culture.
I contacted his communications director back in May of this year, and it was for the reason for Herman Cain to be educated on Israel and to go beyond simply the talking points that we so often see in the media. The sad thing is it was completely turned down, and I have seen Herman Cain stumble, even in media interviews here in Chicago just this past week, where he was trying to talk about Reagan's doctrine and was not able to get it right. And it is so frustrating in this election cycle right now with the candidates that we have. My two horses are not in the race with the evaluation of everybody that's there. I mean, Michelle Bachmann is a great woman, but she's not going to make it. Herman Cain, he's got a lot of work he needs to do. And it's getting more and more frustrating because when these staffs receive phone calls from people who know the issues, and you have to ask, who are the advisors? Me? Yeah, Jacob very well could be an advisor on one of these campaigns on these issues. We already know Jacob did a tremendous job with Bob Turner in New York. Thank goodness, Jacob, for your work on that campaign. It's just we have a lot of political candidates that do not know the issues, and I am sick of the continuous 140-character sound bites that we're getting out of them. I mean, this is what it's come down to. And it's like, no, let's get a candidate that says, you know what, damn it, we are going to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And I'm not just going to say, well, we're talking about it. No, it's going to frickin' happen. It's going to happen. Not this crap that we have seen for so many years where candidates make these pledges that are just garbage, like you said, Aaron, because they tout the line that's nice that AIPAC wants to hear. It's gotten to the point of being ridiculous. We need to have leaders that will actually do things that require them to be bold and courageous, not to sit on the fence and wave your thumb in the wind and see which direction is blowing to make the decision.
Absolutely.
Yeah. With this, we will conclude this very informative. I'm getting very positive feedback on this discussion. Thank you so much, Aaron, for taking your precious time in Israel, and I'll be willing to even make you this coffee in the early morning for you to revive from this battle you had with me. But thank you so much for being a strong voice for Israel. I checked out your website. I will recommend for those seeking translation from Hebrew to English and from English to Hebrew to contact you, and I hope to meet you in the presidential primaries or maybe in the elections here in the United States or when I visit Israel. Thank you so much for coming on to the program.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm going to go outside and enjoy the beautiful sunset in the Galilee.
God bless you. I miss that place.
Shalom, shalom, Aaron.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Eric, final thoughts for this very informative show. And Eric, don't start with your rant now. Be positive.
I just had to after the stuff that we've seen. I truly believe that this election cycle is crucial. Aaron